Welcome back, everyone, to the eCoreAcademy e-learning platform. My name is AJay, back with yet another Algebra 1 video for you all. And in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how to factor quadratic functions. Now, when you think about Algebra 1, you sort of tend to look at, obviously those linear equations, and then moving forward into quadratics. Now, this lesson is going to be very vital when you go into any other upper level math, and obviously throughout this course. It's a culmination of exactly what we've been working on here, and it's essentially at the peak of this course, so at the very end of this course. So before we get into the lesson, please make sure to do 4 things. Hit that subscribe button, turn that post notifications on, hit that like button on this video, and drop a comment down below. Without further ado, let's get right into it. And of course, that's our equation, a squared plus bx plus c for our quadratic function. So now let's take a brief overview of factoring. So what exactly is the goal by me saying factoring? Now, we know what quadratic equations are. They're representative of our regular parabolas, and they have to do with x being squared. So factoring is when you rewrite a trinomial, in this case ax squared plus bx plus c, a quadratic equation, into 2 binomial products. So you're taking a trinomial, 3 terms essentially, you're breaking it apart into 2 different binomials, so 2 terms and 2 terms that both multiply together to create that trinomial. You're going reverse to create those 2 binomials so that each of them can be set equal to 0 in order to solve for the values of x. And of course, x are your zeros, they're known as your zeros. Those are your x-intercepts, your intercepts where they actually cross the x-axis, the parabola itself. So in a trinomial, you'll have 2 forms of x. That's x squared in plain x, so that's x squared plus bx. And when you're doing so, you have 2 different forms of x, so that's going to make it more difficult to solve for just x. In a linear equation, it's easier to solve for it because you're just left with x as a constant. No square roots need to be done, so it's a lot easier to calculate for it. So that's essentially what we're doing here. We're going to split it into 2 binomials, and when we do so, the only variable you have left is x, because we're essentially taking that x squared plus whatever is left into 2x times x plus a different constant, and that's going to equal your x value. A lot easier to solve for. So we'll start off with an expression and move on to a few equations when we do our practice. But before jumping right into the practice, let's take a look at some steps to follow. So let's start off by going in order on how exactly we would approach a problem. So when we're given an expression or a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c, we're going to start off by factoring out any common factors. It's going to be alike in all 3 terms of the trinomial in order to essentially factor it out. So say, for example, if you have a 3 that's common in all of your numbers, like 9x squared plus 6x plus 3, you're going to factor out that 3, and that 3 essentially becomes useless in that case, because 3 is merely going to be an integer value, and we're only looking for x values that can be factored out of the equation. So when you take out the 3, you're making it a lot easier, much smaller numbers to work with. So it should be easier to find patterns of factoring. And essentially, after you've done that, you're going to split apart your x squared term into 2 x products, so x and x. Or if you have a coefficient with that, you're going to split it out accordingly, like 4x squared, that's going to be 2x and 2x. And then you'd add on 2 separate numbers to each x. Now, those 2 separate numbers that you're adding onto each x is going to make your binomials, and they're going to multiply to equal the c term, the very last term of your equation right here. So they're going to multiply. So let's say we have a times b. Those are your 2 terms that are added onto your x's. Those are a times b is going to equal your c value, and then a plus b is going to equal your b value right here. So what does that look like? It's going to look like x plus a times x plus b. All right, now that I've shown you essentially the conceptual side of it, let's take a look at the actual step-by-step process in solving. So now let's take a look at factoring practice number 1, and instead of jumping right into the quadratic equations, we're going to look at the quadratic expression. This way we can master the whole process of splitting up the binomials, and in the next slide I'll show you how to actually solve for those values of x, which is a lot easier. So let's take a look at this expression here. So we have 4x squared minus 4x. Now the first step is always to factor out, so common factor. So in this case, we're looking at 4x squared minus 4x, and obviously we can tell that the most common factor in this case would actually be our 4x, because 4x is in both equations. So when we factor that out, we're left with 4x times x minus 1. Now, in this case, we've just taken out two separate solutions here. Now, we cannot further divide this up, so this is actually going to be our final answer here. When we're factoring out this equation, we started off with our very first step, and that actually ended up giving us both of our terms, because x minus 1, there's no x squared here, so that's your final term, and 4x would be your final answer here. So in this case, if this were equal to 0, we would essentially set both of these equal to 0, both of these solutions equal to 0, because if you think about it, if any value multiplied by 0 is going to equal 0, then that means 4x can be 0, or x minus 1 can be 0 in this case, because there has to be one 0 multiplied in this equation to equal 0. So in this case, 4x can equal 0, and x minus 1 can equal 0. So that means that x is going to equal 0, because 0 divided by 4, x is just going to equal 0, and then x can equal 1. So those are going to be your two solutions here. But now we're going to start to throw in what we're really focused on, and that is splitting up the trinomial into two binomials, the real essence of factoring out these quadratic equations. So let's start off by doing our first step, which is the greatest common factor. Now, automatically when I see here 3x squared, 30x, and 27, I'm looking at 3 because that's our smallest value, and 3 actually goes in evenly to each one of those values. So I'm going to factor out that 3 here. It's not a 3x or a 3x squared because 27 here has no x value, so it's just the integer 3. So that's 3 times x squared plus 10x plus 9, and this is true through our distributive property, because if you distribute 3, it equals this value here, so all you're going to do is divide each value by 3. So we're left with 3 times x squared plus 10x plus 9, and remember what I said, any integer values in this case are actually not going to be of any use in this case. So we only want to look at x values that we can factor out here. I know this is not technically correct, it doesn't equal back, it doesn't equal this initial equation that we were given, but we're only focused on x values because we're solving for them. Since 3 does not have an x value in its factored form as a factor, we're going to eliminate 3, and we can just simplify this down to x squared plus 10x plus 9. Now that we have no more GCFs left, we're actually going to factor this out into two binomials. Now, the first thing that you're going to do, remember the first step, is look at your x squared term, your ax squared term. We know that ax squared does not have a coefficient here. Sorry, it does not have anything more than a 1 coefficient here, so it's just x squared. Now, what are two values of x squared that are equals x squared? So what's the square root of x squared essentially? And the square root of that would essentially be x, because it's just x squared is x. So in this case, it's any two values that multiply to x squared. The simplest way to do that is to find the square root of x squared, and that's x and x. Then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at 9 here, our c value. We're going to start off with our c value. I like to do that personally. And we're going to look at all of the different, multiplicative factors of 9, essentially. So we want to look at those factors. So we have 3 times 3 and 9 times 1. Those are the two sets of factors. So now what we're going to do here is we're going to plug in our 9 and our 1 and our 3 and our 3 here. We're going to add them to our x values here. And we're going to see which one of these values, so essentially which one of these values when multiplied is going to equal this expression here. Hint, hint, it's literally just 9x and 1x together. We're seeing what these two values are equal to, your outer terms and your innermost terms, and they both have to equal and sum up to 10x here. So when we plug this in, just as a trial and error, we're trying out both of these, we see that 9x is going to equal 9 times x is going to equal 9x, and then 1 times x is just going to equal x. When you add them together, this actually does work out, and that's going to equal our 10x as our b value. So our our final step is just going to be rewriting this as x plus 9 and then x plus 1, since we found both of our factors. And since we know that whenever you're multiplying 0 within an equation to equal 0, but either one of these can equal 0, either one of these factors. So in this case, x plus 9 can equal 0 and x plus 1 can equal 0. And then when you rewrite this x plus 9 equals 0, you move the 9 to the other side of the equation. You're left with x equals negative 9. And then here you're left with x equals negative 1. So your two answers here are going to be x equals negative 9 and negative 1. Those are your final answers. Alright everyone, well I hope you all enjoyed this video today. My name is AJay here at the eCoreAcademy at elearning platform. here at the eCoreAcademy Learning Platform. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Check out our website at www.ecoreacademy.org. Email us at ecoreacademy@gmail.com, and check out all of our socials in the description box below. Again, I have made plenty of other courses on the channel in science, and even on our eCore Beyond the Books sections. Also, check out my sister and the other teachers that we have here. So once again, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.